In this video, we'll show you how to convert from R12 to R134a and install an AC kit from AC Solutions on your M20 base BMW E30. The kit from AC Solutions that we'll be installing includes everything that they have available for the E30, including a genuine Sanden compressor, AC Solutions compressor bracket plus hardware and a larger V-belt, a genuine Nissan's parallel flow condenser, all high and low pressure rubber lines plus optional interior lines, and the R134a expansion valve, a full model specific O-ring kit, an OE filter dryer, high and low pressure R134a fittings, edge protectors, and instructions, which are also always available online and updated live. See those via the link in the bio. The E30 that we're working on today is a stock or otherwise unmodified vehicle, meaning that all of the original AC components are still there. Now, aside from some variances in between models with the M20 engine, and especially since this is a convertible with a couple added on pieces, which we'll go into later, this should still be a very true visual reference point for you and your own project. Again, as long as things aren't too extensively modified or missing. And as one final reminder that this video is for M20 based E30s, AC Solutions also has completely different kits for 4-cylinder based E30s, including the M3, and for E30s with 24 valve swaps like the M or S50 family. And now, let's get on to the work. Before one can start disassembly of their AC system, they need to make sure that their Freon is completely evacuated from the system by a professional shop. Even if you're not sure if there's any Freon in the system, it's best to have a shop check, as it is very dangerous for you to inhale, it's illegal for you to discharge, and it's pretty bad for the environment. As you can see, the tools needed are fairly common, all aside from maybe the PAG oil for O-ring installation and PTFE thread sealant or a Freon compatible sealant. We'll be using that specifically for the pressure switch that connects to the filter dryer. The first step in disassembly is disconnecting the negative terminal on your battery. You'll also see we removed the hood bracket, but before we did that, we marked its location for easy reassembly. And in the case of convertibles and some early models where the battery is up in the engine bay, complete removal is necessary as the battery is in the way of some of the lines that we need to disconnect. For those of you that don't have a convertible or weren't familiar in the past, convertibles have a little bit extra reinforcement in a few areas, like this winglet bracket between the strut tower and the fender, as well as a deeper tub in the interior that you'll see a little bit later. This doesn't change anything about disassembly or reassembly aside from these pieces just being in the way. So for you coupes and sedans that don't have it, your work will just be a tiny bit easier, but again, nothing is really that different. So you'll see that we're starting disassembly at the junction between the interior lines and the engine bay, and that's the low pressure suction line that goes from there to the compressor, and the high pressure dryer return line, which is the hard line that goes from that junction down to the filter dryer. Now, even if you're not doing interior lines, you'll still want to disconnect this line or replace the O-ring so that your seal there is 0 years old instead of 40 years old. But again, if you're doing interior lines, we're obviously disconnecting it to replace those lines. Jumping back to removing that low pressure suction line first, then from the compressor as well, keep in mind that the bracket that holds that line will also need to be reused, so keep that and hold it aside for reassembly. Remove your washer fluid tank and strategically plug the pump hole if it is full, like we did here. Remove the plastic cover from the back of the headlight area, and we now have access to the filter dryer and all lines and electrical connections. And the second line that we'll disconnect from the compressor is the high pressure discharge line. This actually connects the compressor to the condenser on the front of the car. It also has a hose clamp and a plastic spacer that we'll need to remove to disassemble this, but we need to save these on the side as we will reuse them for reassembly. And for the final line connections in the engine bay, we have the two lines connected to the filter dryer, the high pressure condenser return line, which is currently on our left, and the high pressure dryer return line, which is the hard line on our right that we will be leaving and reusing. We're also going to be swapping out this late model high and low pressure switch for a brand new R134a specific high pressure switch. The new switch is not available in AC Solutions kits, but here's a part number as well as a link to the product in the description below, and always also in the live updated instructions. Finally, for the filter dryer, we're going to disconnect its electrical connection from this junction here, remove the two bolts holding it to the body, at which point the filter dryer should be free to be removed. We also have the electrical connection for the compressor we have to disconnect, and don't trash any of this, as part of it we do need to reuse. And then all that's left to hold in the compressor is the bracket. And topside, while we're still working in the engine bay, we have a long bolt and nut that we need to loosen up. We're going to take the nut off, but we're going to leave the bolt still installed until we're ready to remove the compressor for a final time from the bottom end of the car. And that's actually what we'll be doing next. So we need to jack up the front end of the car, secure it with jack stands, and then start removing the trim underneath the front end. So this first plastic cover you might not have anymore because it's super common to get rid of, but here are all the locations for plastic nuts or screws that you'll need to take off. This one here we were missing on this side, but on the other side you'll see it there. So go ahead and remove all of these and remove that plastic pan. And now with access to the underside, we can see the compressor, but we can't quite get there yet. First, we have to remove the accessory belts. And first up is going to be the power steering belt. To get this belt off without damaging your bracket and the teeth on the adjustment bracket, it's imperative to loosen the 4 nuts present first before manipulating the adjustment nut. You'll see that the teeth on our compressor bracket have already been eaten up and worn away, and without those, it's really difficult to get proper tension on your belts. Since we're not replacing the power steering bracket, it's important to do this job right. You'll see on our compressor bracket again that the teeth have already been eaten away, but fortunately the AC Solutions kit comes with a brand new compressor bracket that remedies this issue whether or not it needs replacing. So here's a quick visualization of what's required to remove the belt and then the rest of the compressor and the bracket. These 2 nuts on the back side need to be removed before the adjuster can be adjusted and belt taken off. With the belt removed, we head back to the top side to remove that bolt that we left in while we were still working up here. From here, we can let the compressor sag because there is still 1 bolt in the bottom holding on. And with the removal of that bottom bolt, what's left of the compressor bracket and compressor should both be free to be removed. And with that out of there, this is a good time to clean up some hard to reach areas, but we aren't quite done with disassembly yet, so we can save it for later too. At that, next up for disassembly is going to be the front bumper and valence. The front bumper is mainly held on by 2 very large Torx bolts, and once those are removed, you'll need to slide it forward just a little bit and disconnect the 2 electrical connections per side for the lights. You get a little bit of an idea what they look like here, but once this bumper is removed, we'll show you all the innards and how the sliders work, as well as the electrical connections and their orientation. The reason that we're removing the front bumper and valence is to get access to our condenser. And even if you're not replacing the condenser, the reason that we need to move this stuff are the line connections to the condenser. Next up, we have grill and kidney removal. There's a handful of metal circlips on top, as well as screws along the bottom, except for on the kidneys, they're only held in by the metal circlips up top. And we're on to valence removal. So we have 1 screw deep in that pocket there, screw on top there, as well as a Torx head screw right there. Underneath the valence here on the passenger side, this is the most difficult to remove, mainly if you have oil lines. On the driver's side, you can see it a lot easier right there. With the minor access issue being attributed to these oil cooler lines, we could also remove the plastic brake ducting pieces, but wanting to not break anything, Jance was able to finesse his hands in there, get this screw out, and move on. Now, being that you're working on the ground, there is a really good chance that your dog is nearby, so go ahead and pet that guy, because he's a good boy. With those screws removed, we have a couple electrical bits, the ambient temp sensor in the driver's side brake ducting, and of course the fog lights on both sides. Then we can move to the back side of the brake ducting inside the wheel wells, just these plastic covers with a number of screws to remove. With this piece out of the way, we can see some screws that are our next target. We'll show it here on the driver's side though. You actually only have to remove the top screw. This holds on the plastic alignment bracket for the bumper. If you just remove the top, it'll still allow the valence to hold onto that plastic bracket, allowing for easier alignment of the bumper when you go to reassemble. And finally, back on the outside, we just have a screw on each side that holds the valence to the fender, and we can go ahead, pull the fender out, and remove this valence. So once we go back to the top side here and remove this radiator bracket, we do have access to the top brackets for this condenser, but we're going to leave those in the meantime and go down and loosen our lines first. A reminder here that it's super important to brace both sides while you're loosening here. The condenser side isn't meant to rotate. The old lines obviously have the piece that is free to rotate, but especially if you're trying to reuse your condenser, it's important to not bend these lines. And just for any extra information, the top hose is the high pressure condenser line, line B in AC Solutions kit. And the bottom one is the high pressure dryer line. So we can go back up top here, loosen these two bolts to free up the bracket for the condenser. We'll go back to the front, disconnect the electrical connection for the auxiliary fan. And at this point, everything should be disconnected, nice and loose and ready for removal. The condenser does sit on 2 rubber pucks, but with 2 hands, you can shimmy it right past this wire loom and get it out of the car. You'll now see also all this buildup on the radiator. This is a great time to clean any areas that you would otherwise not have access to. And we also decided to rewrap all these wires in brand new Tessa tape, as this had come off at some point. Onto interior, and this is optional for those of you that did order the interior components. First thing we need to do is get the front side of the glove box out of the way by punching these plastic pins out and letting the glove box droop. We don't need to remove the back side. Then we have these screws that run along the whole top side here. This will take off the ECU cover. Aside from the screws, there is a plastic clip that you have to rotate 90 degrees near the back side as well. Once that drops down, disconnect the connections for the glove box light, and then we have one more plastic vanity to remove. We also have another one of those 90-degree clips that you need to rotate. Here's what it looks like outside of the car, and it's a little bit easier to get torque on this with needle nose pliers, so once you get that removed, you can take this plastic vanity out. And with these plastic covers removed, we now have visual access to our interior AC lines, from where they come in from the engine bay all the way over to the expansion valve, which is connected to the in-dash evaporator. And like mentioned earlier, this is another thing that we have to deal with only in convertibles in this deeper tub. So we just remove these plastic clips and then we can move on to the kick panel, which has one single screw, pull the rubber stripping. Us convertible guys have to loosen up this plastic tub a little bit and we can slide that kick panel cover off the speaker area, giving us access to where those interior lines go up into the engine bay. Next, we need to gain access to the expansion valve, and to do that, we have a couple plastic covers and we need to remove these lines. So first up, we're going to remove this screw and pop off the cover for the floor vents. From there, it's time to break the lines loose, and what we should have done here, you'll see in the note on screen, is brace the expansion valve as best we could. We didn't in this case and everything went okay, but again, it's always best practice to be bracing everything you're tightening or loosening with these. So with those both loosened and pulled off the expansion valve, we can go ahead and remove these interior lines. It won't be surprising as you remove the interior lines if they decide to pull the rubber gasket that normally goes between the interior and the engine bay with them. It is good practice to have a brand new one ordered, but in our case, we were able to just clean it up and reinstall it. Upon reinstalling this gasket, it is also a good idea to lube the insides of the holes, so when you push the new lines through there, they'll slip and they won't pull the gasket with them through to the engine bay. Next up might be the hardest part of the interior job, and that's removing the 4 screws that secure this cover for the expansion valve and the side of the in-dash evaporator. I used my iPhone to give you a slight look at where all the heads of these Torx head screws are. This might be easier if the whole glove box was removed, but again, we decided our past vendettas with installing the bottom brackets of these glove boxes warranted us just leaving it in and finding tight spaces to reach through and loosen it. We used wobble heads as well as extensions to get this thing loose, and though difficult, it is possible, and we got the job done. With the expansion valve exposed, if for any reason you're going to reuse this expansion valve, it's good to put tape over top of it once those lines are removed, just so this foam that you also have to remove doesn't fall into it. Since we're replacing it, it didn't matter to us. Next up, we're breaking loose the lines coming from the in-dash evaporator to this expansion valve. Again, this is where it's very important to be bracing or counter-holding with these lines. We're not replacing or opening up the dash to get this evaporator out. So with that braced and these lines broken loose, we can get the expansion valve out and start our cleaning and reassembly. For those that did order the R134a specific expansion valve, it will be important when you pull your old one off just to note the orientation. We did seem to find that this can only go on one specific way, but again, just a reminder to avoid any frustration. And for your information, the reason for an R134a specific expansion valve is that R12 and R134a are obviously different Freons, so this is valved specifically for appropriate pressure of R134a Freon. Now that everything's fully disassembled, it's time to flush any parts to be reused with an appropriate AC system cleaner. This is to make sure everything is squeaky clean and seals up properly and functions properly once it's time to recharge. Next up, we have PAG oil and the soaking of all your brand new O-rings to seal up the system properly. Now, PAG oil is what lubricates your entire AC system, but the appropriate amount has already been added to your compressor, so you're not here to add any to the system. It's purely for lubrication of these O-rings so that they seal properly when you tighten everything up. So again, simply just lubricate these O-rings, place them on the appropriate size connections, start to mate the connections by hand, and from there snug and tighten everything down. A common question here is, since we can only get open-end box wrenches on these connections, how tight do I tighten these things down? And the general rule of thumb with these is, again, start by hand to make sure the threading is going in properly, counterhold everything, and once it's firmly snug, complete it with a final quarter turn of tightness. With the size of these connections, it's easy to confuse them thinking that they need to be incredibly tight, but that's where the seals pick up the slack, sealing everything perfectly fine without incredible over-tightening. With our expansion valve installed, we put a piece of tape over so that we can reinstall the cover and foam around it without spilling any contaminants inside of our brand new expansion valve and clean system. Next up, we have our interior lines. And you may notice on the old lines that the larger of the two, or the low pressure line, has insulation wrapped around the metal portions of it. And this is something that we do need to duplicate with the provided cork tape from AC Solutions. What we're doing is we're wrapping the metal portions just to avoid any condensation from dripping into the glove box or the interior of your car. This cork tape is very malleable, and it's best to start at somewhat of an angle so that when you twist it all the way down the line, it continues moving downward while still covering everything. It'll form a triangle near the bottom of the metal, at which point you'll need to cut. But make sure if you're using a knife directly on the line that you're only touching the metal portion. Otherwise, cut the cork tape while it's suspended off of the line before placing it on. If any part of the knife touches the rubber area of the hose, it could easily create a vulnerable spot that could explode under pressure. With the low pressure line prepped, it's time to prep both of the interior lines with their brand new seals lubricated with PAG oil. So we decided to pre-install the O-rings only on the side of the expansion valve, as this is a little bit hard to maneuver them over the ECU loom and then install them while they're suspended in the air. We didn't do them on the side that still needs to poke through to the engine bay. For that, we're going to leave the protective blue caps on, take those off once they're poked through to the engine bay, and then install their O-rings once they're ready to be completely tightened and installed. So now being time to install the interior lines. First up is the now insulated larger low pressure line that goes towards the front of the car. You'll see it here poking through the firewall, and that black stuff is just lubricating grease that we put on so it would slide through and not grab the seal and push it out. From here, situate its orientation, hand tighten, snug it down with a wrench, counterhold it with the expansion valve, and do a final tight quarter turn to complete installation. Completing the tightening of that low pressure line closest to the firewall first before putting in the smaller high pressure line will help you a lot, as you'll notice when the second line goes in, it's very difficult to get an angle on that back line, let alone tighten it very quickly. So with the low pressure line done, duplicate the process with the high pressure line, again orientating it, hand tightening it, snugging it with a wrench, counterhold, and a final quarter turn. And moving back to the engine bay, while we're still missing one low pressure line to connect to the interior line, we can install a brand new O-ring and complete installation on the high pressure line. Again, snug and tighten a final quarter turn, and you have just completed the installation of your interior lines. From here, reinstall all of the trim, covers, and the attachments for the glove box, and the assembly on this side of the system is completed. For those of us planning to reuse their auxiliary fan but not reuse their condenser, we need to swap over the auxiliary fan to the AC Solutions prepped condenser. Now all the mounts are exactly the same, so all we need to do is remove the fan from the old condenser and swap over the rubber bushings and hardware to the new condenser. As you'll notice for the auxiliary fan, there are 3 mounting points, and each mounting point is held together by 1 nut, 1 crush washer, 1 fender washer, and 1 bolt. Trust me, here there are 3 bolts, but right here there are not 3 bolts, they're just still installed. So with those bolts removed, we're able to pull the fan out of those mounts. We had 1 rubber bushing stay with the fan and 2 stay behind, so with those pulled out, we're able to transfer the rubber bushings over to the new condenser first. With those rubber bushings in place, we can then position our fan and start to slide in the mounting bolts from the inside facing the outside. Because what you'll notice on the inside of the fan's outer bracket is a recessed area for the head of the bolt, working as a counterhold for easy and firm mounting. With the auxiliary fan swapped over to the new condenser, it's time to lower the hood and swap the unit back into its original place. Before we go back up to the engine bay to secure the top mounts for the condenser, it's important to make sure the bottom mounts are seated flat and properly on the rubber bushings. As well, reconnect the electrical connection for the auxiliary fan and retie it into its loom. Then reopen the hood to the engine bay, secure the top 2 bolts for the condenser mounting, and then reconnect and secure the upper radiator mounting bracket. Before installing the new compressor, we're going to steal the original harness for that OEM fitment and look. When examining the original connection from the body harness to the harness for the compressor, you'll notice that on the body side there's a wire jump, connecting 2 of the 3 wires on the compressor's harness back to one another. This is actually a temperature sensor on the old one that would cut power. With the change in materials and much higher efficiency, our new compressor will always run at much lower temps, omitting the need for this temperature switch. So don't confuse the bolt head sitting on the new compressor for something that needs to be removed or swapped. So all we're going to do is de-pin the wires that are no longer needed by sliding this cap up, pulling the wires out, and then pushing that cap back down. It is obviously important to pay attention to which wire you're leaving in there as to which wire on the body harness side is still intact as well. And since this wire connector is not a weatherproof connection, we can leave these holes open. With the unneeded wires de-pinned, we can now clip the last wire on the old compressor and get ready to transfer it to our new compressor's wire. With each side's wire stripped, grab the provided heat shrink and electrical crimp connector, making sure to first slide the heat shrink on one side of the connection, then crimping the wires together. Once crimped together, give each side of the wires a pull to make sure it's a solid connection, and then slide the heat shrink over the connection, and then shrink the heat shrink with heat. Now switching our focus over to the mounting of the compressor, it is worth noting that we did have to reposition the mounting point via the mount for these oil cooler lines near the radiator. You'll also later notice that we used a zip tie to hold these lines together, all on purpose to not interfere with the spinning of the compressor. If you don't have these oil cooler lines, your install will just be a tiny bit easier. Moving on now, the mounting of the upgraded AC Solutions compressor bracket. Simply slip the 2 long bolts through the original mounting holes, and at this point we can go ahead and fully tighten the nuts on the opposite sides. Next, we'll position the compressor up into the bracket with this specific orientation, then slipping the lower bolts into place. We can then hand tighten the oval lock nuts, but we won't do their final torque until the V-belt is on and final assembly is ready. As you can see here, you will want to pay attention to where your wire is. We waited to plug this in until everything was in its final position though. Next up, orientate the compressor with the adjustment grooves on the top side of the bracket, slip the next bolts in, and loosely secure them with their oval lock nuts. Then it's time to position the new V-belt. And for those savvy viewers this deep and far into the video, there's typically a little notch in the plastic engine fan to help with the installation of the V-belt, since it's a very tight space between that fan and the crank pulley. Pay attention to the alignment of the pulley on the compressor and the crank pulley. The V-belt should be going into the furthest forward groove on the compressor's pulley. To begin the process of tensioning the belt and tightening the compressor down, we'll want to start with the top bolts first. It helps to use the closed ends of box wrenches to apply pressure downward, almost using your body weight or more tension from your hands to keep tension on the V-belt as you tighten the lock nuts. Once you tighten the top 2 bolts and nuts, check the tension of the belt and make sure it's nice and firm. Follow that up by tightening the bottom 2 bolts, fully securing the compressor and V-belt into position. Then reinstall the power steering's V-belt and retension and secure the power steering via the teethed adjustment bracket, softly tensioning the teethed adjustment bracket first, then putting final torque on all the accessory bolts. Then, in final regards to the compressor installation, we'll go back up to the top side of the engine bay and reconnect its electrical connection. As we move on to the prep of our new filter dryer, there is one item we again need to look at, and that's the pressure switch. As we have a late model E30, our car was equipped with a late model high and low pressure combo switch. In order to complete this conversion, we need to change over to an early model high pressure switch. This switch isn't included in AC Solutions kit, but the part number and a link on where to buy it is included in AC Solutions live instructions online, as well as the part number here on screen. In order to prep our new high pressure switch before installing it in the filter dryer, we need to coat the threads with a Freon or gas compatible thread sealant or PTFE tape, usually the yellow kind. Next, we'll open the appropriate port for this high pressure switch on the new filter dryer. You'll notice some gas leaking out as these are pre-charged with nitrogen. Start the threading of the high pressure switch by hand to ensure it's going in properly, then complete it with an open end wrench. Tighten it until it's snug and complete with a final quarter turn, but as you'll see, it's important not to completely seat the switch, as this is an NPT thread, meaning that it's a tapered thread, so it will get significantly tighter as you tighten it down, and it cannot and should not be completely seated in the filter dryer. Next, we screwed on the adapter for the high pressure connection of the AC system. This is the one with the red cap. For this one, we snugged it by hand and did a final tightening with the channel locks. This is yet another connection that does not need to be over tightened, just make sure it's firmly tightened with a final quarter turn. And finally, for filter dryer prep, we need to swap over the old harness from our high and low pressure switch to our new high pressure switch. This is as simple as cutting the wires from both switches and combining the wires of the old harness to the wires of the new pressure switch. It's worth noting that the wiring to this switch is its own closed loop, and polarity can work either way, so it doesn't matter which wire you connect to which. Make sure to put that heat shrink on first, crimp them together, and then shrink everything down for a final sealed result. With our new filter dryer outfitted, we're able to slip it into the body and lightly secure them with the body mounting screws, not completely tightening them yet, as we wanted to make sure we can fit and align all of our new seals and lines first, then tightening everything down. With the high pressure switch electrical connection plugged back in, we decided to move on to our high pressure dryer return line, the original hard line that runs the length of the fender, first putting an O-ring with PAG oil on it, then securing it to the filter dryer. And now we're on to completing the installation of all of our brand new AC lines from AC Solutions. First up is line C on their chart, the high pressure condenser return line, running from the condenser on the front of the car to our filter dryer. And for a little bit of fitment help, here's a visualization of the bending of the brand new line. Obviously these brand new lines haven't been fitted and sat in a car for 30 to 40 years, so they will need to be bent, held, and set into place as they're installed. Keep in mind here as well that even though we might not be seeing every specific connection as it's going together on camera, each male end of the connection will be having an O-ring soaked in PAG oil put on. And as a continuing reminder, make sure you're bracing everything that you can as you tighten it, snug it, and only finish it with a final quarter turn. None of these need to be over tightened, again because the O-rings are doing the sealing for you. Line B will be our high pressure discharge line, going from the compressor to the condenser. The condenser side is the longer metal side with the final long elbow reaching up to the top part of the condenser. And with this line in place, we started the installation on the condenser side, getting it a little bit tight with box end wrenches, but then moved both to the engine bay and underneath the car to make sure that the orientation of the line could fit for installation to the compressor and to the hose clamp body mount. With fitment and orientation confirmed, we went ahead and completed the tightening on the condenser side, but we left the final tightening onto the compressor until our last line was installed as well. And for that final line, we have line A, our low pressure suction line, going from the junction at the firewall from the interior all the way down to our compressor. And here again is an idea of the orientation and bends that this line will go through when fitted. Once again, those of us with convertibles will have a little extra time fitting this, with the upper metal portion having to go underneath that convertible specific strut tower reinforcement bracket. And for visual assistance, here are a few shots of this line before being secured on either side or to that hose clamp bracket on the strut tower. The The first connection we made was line A to line Y, both low pressure lines at this interior junction. Again with a fresh O-ring soaked in PAG oil, snug with box end wrenches and only a final quarter turn. Then down on the compressor side of the line, we hand tightened things again with an O-ring and soaked in PAG oil and started the alignment or orientation of both lines heading into the compressor. In this situation, it is convenient to have a second set of hands up top to confirm and hold on to the orientation of these lines as the person underneath the car secures the lines to the compressor. Again, although the fittings seem large, do not over tighten these lines. This is the one area of example where you don't have the opportunity to counterhold what you're tightening to. Simply snug it tightly with a box end wrench and complete it with a final quarter turn. We then installed the hose clamp style mount on the lower portion of the strut tower. Then using the provided edge trim, we installed it in areas where lines might rub on any sharp edges. You'll notice in the convertible that the high pressure dry return line on the outside of that strut tower bracket already has one, so we installed an extra one for our new low pressure line, and then as well down on the frame rail for that line between the condenser and compressor. And for the final piece of our AC system installation, we have the low pressure adapter to go on to line A, the low pressure line up by the strut tower. This is the adapter in the kit with the blue cap. Again, firmly snug, and then a final quarter turn. From here, we can reinstall pieces like our hood bracket, body moldings, and battery, but this is also a convenient time to double check the installation and functionality of pieces in your new kit and pieces to be reused. For instance, electrical components like the interior switch to turn on the AC system or your auxiliary fan, testing ohm values with a multimeter, and so on. When you're satisfied with the installation of your AC kit and your body components are reinstalled, it'll then be time to pull vacuum on the system for at least an hour to confirm the system's ability to hold pressure properly. From here, a professional shop can fill the system to capacity based on the factory R12 sticker, though adjusted for the R134a Freon conversion factor and relative ambient temperatures. For any troubleshooting questions or again for the complete instructions, visit AC Solutions' website, as these instructions are always available and updated live.